I have one passion in life, it's comparing different versions of the same movie. In the case of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, I think it's interesting that a film so popular to analyze, it has an entire documentary on the subject. It doesn't generally go discuss that which version you see might affect how you interpret the movie. In America, we're familiar with a version that's around 2 hours 23-ish minutes, while other territories got one just shy of 2 hours. Kubrick considered both to be director's cuts, but came to prefer the shorter version. And this is something that I disagree with, so if you're a fan of the shorter version, bear with me, this might not be the video for you. In breaking down the two versions, I'm going to presume that you've seen The Shining, so if you haven't, you're going to want to go watch either version. I'm also not going to be discussing differences between Stephen King's book and the film, or the fact it had an original ending or other scenes removed, because that's outside of what's generally available to the public as Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Before I really get started, I'd like to give a shout out to IMDb's alternate versions page, as well as moviecensorship.com, both of which could have helped me a lot had I looked at either before doing this. Both do a great job of breaking down the differences between the two versions. The first change comes at around the 5-minute mark, when Wendy tells Danny that they'll all have a good time at the hotel, and this is followed by a dissolve to Jack being introduced to the late arriving Bill Watson, played by Barry Dennen. Then came an exposition dump, where we learn that Jack was a school teacher, is a writer, comes highly recommended, and his family's caretaking tenure is to begin the day before Halloween, although Halloween is never specifically mentioned. They also talk about why the Overlook isn't open during the winter. House calls still being a thing in the 80s, the doctor examines Danny after his seizure. Danny tells the doctor about Tony, which is interesting because he's reluctant to talk about Tony to Scatman Crothers' Halloran character later. When Wendy and the doctor go into the living room to talk, Wendy's about to break trauma becomes apparent as she goes to light her cigarette, catching the doctor's attention. The opportunity to let us know about Jack having been a schoolteacher is again removed, as well as introducing Danny's injury, which we learn was the result of Jack having been an alcoholic. Although Jack discusses this with the phantom bartender Lloyd, it lays the groundwork for an open interpretation of what follows to either be Jack's descent into madness, or how and why he is so susceptible to the spirits of the hotel. Wendy marvels at the Navajo-inspired stained glass during the introductory walkthrough. While none of the dialogue lost is important, it removes a possible reference to Tecumseh's curse.
We had 4 presidents who stayed here.
As Jack and Wendy check out their room, some dialogue is cut, as well as a dissolve to their being shown the exterior of the hedge maze that will become so important later. Although this dialogue again is not very important, it does remove Ullman's joke that he wouldn't want to go into the maze unless he had an hour to spare to find his way out. Another cut just before a dissolve, this time removing the information that Jack no longer drinks alcohol, and the introduction of Scatman Crothers' Dick Halloran character, explaining who Wendy and Danny have gone off with to explore the kitchen, and when they were separated from Jack and the others. Halloran's friendly interrogation of Danny is cut mid-scene, where Danny begins to show he suspects Halloran's jovial questions mask a more serious concern and fear, while the shorter cut goes directly to Danny asking if there's something bad at the hotel. Removing this takes away hinting at how strong Danny is at shining. A sequence of Wendy wheeling a breakfast cart up to their room has been deleted, as well as tightening some footage of Danny wheeling around the hotel. It's hard to argue against removing it, but it's interesting Kubrick didn't cut more of this type of footage, opting instead to cut more dialogue-heavy scenes. I think this is the biggest Catch-22 cut. Dramatically, it makes perfect sense to stop the scene with Jack's response to Wendy about his writer's block.
That's all it is.
But in the longer cut, he tells Wendy he felt like he knew what was going to be around every corner when he went for his interview, and goofs on how spooky this was. Another transitional dissolve is cut too, this time to Jack's typewriter. Dissolves are heavily targeted for the shorter version, and there are no different music cues, insert shots, or alternate takes between the two cuts, something you don't usually see when a director reworks their film. Kubrick's Clockwork Orange is a good example, the R-rated version using different footage in precisely one shot to satisfy the MPAA. There are no instances of this in the shorter cut, indicating it was merely cut down from the longer one. Jack throwing a ball at a wall and Wendy and Danny running to play in the maze are cut. Hard to argue against, but it does remove a rather dark joke about the sites being built on an Indian burial ground.
Loser has to keep America clean. How's that?
People start pollution. People can stop it.
Wendy opening a can of fruit cocktail while watching the TV report is removed. The TV is what's important here, foreshadowing their going from being isolated to being trapped. It also gives a semi-callback to the Donner Party reference from earlier in the film, reporters discussing a couple lost in the storm as it rages elsewhere.
They got snowbound one winter in the mountains.
Admittedly, no essential information is lost, although it's yet another cut you could argue removes tension. I think this is one of the weirder trims in the film, as it tightens up footage around the title card Thursday while simultaneously removing the title card Thursday. Since nothing seems to have happened much on Thursday apart from Wendy and Danny playing in the snow while Jack makes crazy eyes, I'm not sure why Kubrick didn't remove the day's events altogether. A scene of Danny asking Wendy if he can get his fire truck is removed. The scene begins with a close-up on a television, and it's worth noting several deleted scenes involve watching or having a television on. You could argue this helps keep the film from dating, but the fashions and technology in the film are practically their own character. It's also a little weird because televisions are a link to Nicholson's improvised "Here's Johnny" line later in the film. Although I think Kubrick claimed he didn't know what Nicholson was referring to when he improvised this, Ed McMahon had been saying it to introduce Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show since at least 1964.
Here's Johnny!
Again, no real info is lost, but you could argue it removes tension. In the shorter version, the sequence begins with Danny opening the door to his parents' room. Some of Jack talking to Lloyd the bartender is trimmed. Although I do think Jack Nicholson is great in the film, trimming some of his over-the-topness probably benefits his performance. A line is cut where Jack reminds us of Danny's episode before they're leaving for the hotel. Since this only cuts the film down by a few seconds, I'm not really sure why it was targeted for removal, but since the next shot reminds us of the previous episode anyway, it doesn't really seem important. I think the cuts around Halloran's decision to get to the Overlook are a little weird. Footage of his waiting on the phone to talk to the ranger is trimmed, but it's questionable if you need to see him on the phone at all after having such a strong vision. Why he wouldn't just trust it may be human, but it's not very logical. This is one of two cuts I think genuinely damages the film, and both involve Shelley Duvall. It shows Wendy forming a plan of escape, while also beginning to accept the fact that Jack might be dangerous. And removing the scene robs her character's transformation of battered wife to protective mother. Equally bad as it removes Danny's reveal that he has now been entirely taken over by Tony. It's unclear whether Danny has retreated into his unconscious, is being protected supernaturally, or both. As with the influential The Haunting, we know something supernatural is going on, but the possibility of interpreting it as a character's mental breakdown allows the supernatural elements to be seen as more of a reflection of reality. Jack removing additional radio components and Halloran's follow-up phone conversation with the Park Service is cut. None of it is essential, but it does call attention to the, in my opinion, strange way Kubrick cuts down the sequence of Halloran getting to the Overlook. Both cuts use an establishing shot of the plane Halloran's on and a cut to zooming out from his face, but the abridged version removes his asking a stewardess when they'll get to Denver, footage of Jack's typing, the plane landing, and Halloran calling his friend Larry about renting a snowcat. In fact, Larry, played by Tony Burton in a scene made up of dissolves and a television on in the background, both things that really get the axe in the shorter version, is removed altogether. It seems like it might have made more sense to cut scenes without dialogue and keep more with, since the shorter version cuts from the plane, to Halloran driving a car in the snow, but at no point is it addressed how Halloran picks up the snowcat he arrives in. Some footage of Halloran driving in the snow is removed, followed by Wendy telling Danny she's going to go talk to Daddy for a while, then going and quietly picking up a baseball bat. This is the second cut scene with Wendy I'm upset about losing, since it continued her transformation. After a long stretch of no changes, the scene of Wendy wandering into some skeletons is removed, and there are arguments for and against the cut. I personally like it, as it again flirts with depicting a supernatural event or complete mental breakdown, but some find the skeletons fake-looking, and let's be honest, don't like Wendy's histrionics. I think if you're going to push-pull Wendy footage, it's harder to argue for this than, say, her going and picking up a baseball bat or formulating a plan. But it is the last supernatural event in the film that isn't just witnessed by us, the audience. Some footage of Jack chasing Danny through the maze is cut, so little in fact that I almost wonder if it's not a mistake. The two versions then close out exactly the same. I will admit going into this, I preferred the longer version most likely, but I didn't really understand why until now. I think allowing Wendy to grow as a character is the only grounded through point in the entire film. That really only happens in the longer cut. Looked at as a narrative, both versions could use a little work from a dramatic or pacing standpoint probably. And if you're not a fan of Wendy, think how her scenes might play better if Kubrick had been more interested in presenting her as someone scared of Jack, rather than someone there to simply be scared by Jack. I read somewhere Kubrick became unhappy with Duvall's performance somewhere down the line, and is why he got so many of her scenes. The first Razzie Awards didn't like her either, and she was among the first people ever nominated for one. Although this was rescinded in 2022, I'm not really sure what good anyone thought this would do since it really just spotlights her nomination. Sorry Razzies, no one really remembers who was nominated or won any of your awards. It was Brooke Shields, by the way. Shelley Duvall lost to Brooke Shields. Kubrick often enjoyed putting his most impressive visuals up front, making them hard to top even though there was still a lot of movie left to go. In The Shining, this happens when Danny sees the blood elevator and the twins, even before they get to the Overlook. Kubrick even used an elevator outtake for an entire trailer when the film came out. Forget seeing it less than 12 minutes in. If you were among the first to see it in 1980, you may have already witnessed this scene before you even sat down in the theater. The edits made to the shorter version indicate to me Kubrick wanted to make a film similar to John Carpenter's Halloween. A scary movie that's smarter than it may at first seem, but in the end felt like it was just a fun ghost story. Both films make use of then relatively new moving camera rigs, the Steadicam on The Shining and Panaglide on Halloween, so both sometimes have a similar feel and stylistic flourishes. Michael Myers is more stand-in brother-boyfriend though than abusive father figure, and while Halloween's surprise ending is a scary all-in-good-fun jump scare, The Shining has a more serious undercurrent running through it, making it unavoidably and thematically more unpleasant. I don't have a problem with Jax being crazy from frame one. To me, that's a feature, not a flaw. But Wendy is the only character with a point A to point B progression, and again, that's only in the longer cut. Jack does get crazier through the course of the film, but this fluctuates, like he's on some kind of crazy gas ventilator that's on the fritz. And I find it weird both cuts keep that long zoom shot of Jack doing crazy eyes, seemingly for no other reason than to freak out an audience. The Shining is filled with iconic shots of Jack Nicholson's face, and it draws attention to itself that Kubrick just liked this kind of shot. From Malcolm McDowell in A Clockwork Orange to Vincent D'Onofrio in Full Metal Jacket, we know crazy eyes means a character is currently out of their mind. So the question becomes, what does this add to The Shining? In A Clockwork Orange, it kicks off the entire events of the film. In Full Metal Jacket, it means the end of an entire segment. In The Shining, it means it's Thursday. There's also remnants of material missing in both cuts, such as when Danny remembers Halloran telling him Shining moments are like pages in a book. Nowhere in either version does Halloran tell Danny anything about pages in a book. And even if you don't need to see this to make reference to it, it again makes me wonder why Kubrick kept what he kept and cut what he cut. At the same time, if at this point you don't think I consider Kubrick's The Shining a major work of art, I think it succeeds as playing more like a nightmare than as conventional narrative. And while you could argue the problems this might bring from a dramatic standpoint, taken as dream logic, the narrative's just fine as it is, and there's a reason why The Shining is now considered one of Kubrick's best films, rather than the turkey it was considered when it was first released. While I personally prefer the longer cut, Kubrick supposedly disagreed, so I encourage people to see both, particularly since the shorter version appears to be being phased out of physical media releases and streaming. Even if I don't like it as much, it should still be available for people to see if Kubrick really preferred it. Well, that's pretty much my take on the two versions of The Shining. I'm kind of testing the waters here, so if you'd like to see me do more of these kinds of videos, please comment, like, and subscribe. According to pretty much every video on this website, this really helps me out.